Welcome to Know Your Rights New Jersey. I'm your host, Rhinold Ponder. Today on the show, we'll discuss legal rights for LGBT couples and families. Joining us is John Nachlinger, an attorney with Previte and Nachlinger. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Let's start with, tell us the difference between civil unions and marriage, if there is any.
Well, these days, there's not a lot of difference other than the fact that someone who's in a civil union isn't considered to be married when you're in the state of New Jersey. Second, you leave the state of New Jersey. If you're in a civil union, you really have no rights as far as the federal government's concerned, and in other states, you may or may not have any rights depending on what their laws are. But for all intents and purposes, today, you can't enter into a new civil union in all likelihood if you want any federal benefits at all. So if you want any federal benefits, you have to enter into a marriage. Now today you can still enter into a civil union because our legislator hasn't removed that as an option yet, although there is a movement afoot to get rid of an option to enter into a civil union. So if you're married and you're a same-sex couple and you're married, you have the same rights as any married couple would, no matter where you go in the country as far as the federal government's concerned. But until the Supreme Court rules this June on what happens in terms of same-sex marriage in states that don't currently recognize it, your rights in terms of a married couple may or may not go with you to another state the second you leave our borders.
So with that said, what about the rights of those who were not married or are in a civil union? Well, I guess not in a civil union, coming to New Jersey. What about those rights?
Well, if you're not in a civil union, in terms of you're married in another state, if you're in a legally recognized marriage in another state, New Jersey considers you married. Okay. If you're in a married-like relationship in another state, other states have civil unions, domestic partnerships that are similar to our civil union, which is that it's all the rights and obligations of marriage just without calling it marriage. You would be in a civil union if you come to New Jersey under existing law.
What if a same-sex couple wants to end a marriage in New Jersey?
You would do it exactly as you would a opposite-sex marriage. And in fact, dissolving a civil union has the same laws as divorce. It's the exact same laws. So if you're dissolving a civil union or you're a same-sex couple getting divorced, you would be subject to our alimony statute, you'd be subject to our equitable distribution statute, and really the issues that are that are coming to play now that are a little bit different are what happens to the long-term relationships. There's a lot of gay and lesbian couples that have been together for 25, 30 years, and they could just enter into a civil union, a mere less than 10 years ago. And now they may or may not have also been married. What do we do with the house they purchased 20 years ago in one of the parties' names?
Have the courts decided that yet? Or?
No, not yet, but I'm sure it's coming soon. Until the appellate division rules on that issue, and what do we do in terms of both alimony, because one of the factors of alimony is duration of marriage. So obviously if you're together for 25 years but only married for 5, the duration is probably 5 unless the court expands the term. Same thing with equitable distribution. So really, we're really waiting to see what the court's going to do, but fortunately most gay and lesbian couples are smart enough to know that they shouldn't rely upon the courts to decide what they're going to do.
Right. Now, how does the civil union, should it impact tax planning for couples?
Well, if you're in a civil union, you cannot file a joint federal tax return. You're also not exempt from any federal estate taxes if you were to pass away. As far as New Jersey is concerned, you can file a joint tax return in New Jersey if you're in a civil union, and you're exempt from the estate taxes just like you would if you were a married couple. So these days, same-sex couples actually have an option that opposite-sex couples don't have.
Okay.
And maybe it's payback for all the years we weren't able to be in any relationship, but you can decide.
Small payback.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can decide, be in a civil union, and you can file separate federal tax returns, which, some people have rental properties and other things that may be phased out at income levels. Sometimes they can plan their taxes a little bit better than even opposite-sex married couples can.
Tell me a little bit about the rights of same-sex couples to spousal health benefits.
Well, New Jersey, ever since domestic partnerships came about back in 2004, continuing to civil unions, continuing to marriage now, if a New Jersey employer offers benefits to spouses, they must offer benefits to domestic partners, civil union partners, or married spouses.
Mm-hmm.
So really, New Jersey's been at the forefront of this for years in terms of if you offer it to married couples, you have to offer it to anyone that's in a legally recognized relationship in our state. So there's really no difference. However, since the federal government doesn't recognize civil unions or domestic partnerships, it really depends on what the administration has to say when it comes to federal employees who live in New Jersey's benefits with regard to health benefits. Fortunately, we have a president right now who has been very liberal in terms of expanding benefits to same-sex couples of federal employees. But the next administration may not be as
I was
generous.
going to ask you, so is that by executive order? That's not, when you say that the president has been, generous is not the word, but has been on the right side.
Yeah, that's executive order, so that's something that could be changed because it's only federal employees. Because if you're a private employer in New Jersey, then you're subject to the laws I just outlined, that you have to provide the same benefits to same-sex couples who are in legally recognized relationships as you do married spouses.
Talk to me a little bit more about divorce for same-sex couples. It's been 10 years. Are we starting to see developments in that area?
Well, I always laugh. It's very similar to opposite-sex couples who were together for a long time. They get married, and all of a sudden they get divorced. It's almost as though sometimes just getting married creates the situation, and it stresses that they never lived under before. But we are starting to see. A uptick, or at least I'm starting to see an uptick in the number of people who are coming in with these issues. I mean, traditionally to this point, our issues have really been revolving around children of same-sex couples because we really haven't had to fight about how to dissolve anything because there hasn't been anything to dissolve. But yes, we are starting to see more and more, and the problem is that very few people, very few attorneys really are at the forefront of these issues and really know what's going on, and they tend to treat same-sex couples and their divorces just like they would treat any opposite-sex couple divorce, and it really becomes problematic when they don't understand the intricacies, for example, tax intricacies. Because if you're in a civil union, you're dissolving a civil union, you don't have access to the same tax laws that people who are being divorced have access to, in terms of if you're dividing up assets, let's say a retirement asset, and you're transferring $200,000 to your civil union partner, that's not exempt from federal taxes the way it would be if you were getting divorced.
Let's move on to probably one of the hottest and more complicated issues regarding same-sex couples and children. If a spouse has a child biologically, what are the rights of the other parent?
Well, we have a parentage law in New Jersey, and basically what happens is if you're married to a mother who gives birth, whether you're same sex or opposite sex, you're presumed under New Jersey law to be the second legal parent of the child. Now, that's a presumption that can be overcome. I won't talk about that today, but it can be overcome. But you're presumed to be the legal parent. If you're not married, that's where the issues start to come in. Because if you're not married, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, more and more children are being born to unmarried couples these days. The divorce rate's going down, but that's because the marriage rate's also going down, which is an interesting dichotomy. But if you're not married, then you're left with this limbo, because if the mother who gives birth and you do not sign a parentage certification, and then you're placed on the birth certificate, you are not a legal parent as far as New Jersey is concerned. So then you would be left with having to go to court to enforce your rights. And going to court to enforce your rights really only works if you're a biological father to a child, because then you can assert your biological rights. Otherwise, you're really left in a situation where if you're not a legal parent, you're a legal stranger, unless the parent decides to do a second parent adoption sometime later in the child's life.
Explain to me, I want to go back to this parentage certification. How does that process work?
At the hospital, first of all, if you're not married, for a second parent to be put on a birth certificate,
yes,
the law actually requires that this certification be signed by both the mother who gave birth and the other parent. And basically, it's just a certification acknowledging that that is the other parent, that is the legal parent. So in essence, if it's two women or two men that are involved with this, the issue really becomes, are both the parties in agreement that the rights are going to be conveyed? So basically, the law conveys the rights if both the parties agree at the time of birth that the rights should be conveyed to the non-biological parent.
So are there any legal rights for the non-biological parents if they can't agree? They're right there in the delivery room and they don't agree.
Well, unfortunately, it happens far too often. And well, I'd say what happens more often than not is people don't recognize that they can do it. They don't recognize that they can convey the legal rights immediately upon birth. Now, my advice to all of my clients is, if let's use a lesbian couple for example.
Right.
One gives birth, the other one's there. Even if you signed a parentage certification and the second parent is put on the birth certificate, because of the state of the law in the country, and there are some states that may not recognize two mothers being on a birth certificate, we always recommend in my office that the parties do a second parent adoption, because a judgment of adoption is recognized in every state of the country, and that is not subject to any federal laws that preempt full faith and credit like DOMA does, which is why if you're married in New Jersey and you go to Alabama, Alabama doesn't recognize a same-sex marriage, because there's still a law that says full faith and credit doesn't apply in that limited circumstance. But the Supreme Court's dealing with that this spring, and we'll rule in June. We'll see what happens there.
John, that's fantastic to know. But for now, we'll stop there and we'll take a 30-second break. We'll be back to discuss with John more about legal adoption and what type of attorneys you should be looking for. See you in 30. Welcome. We're back with John Nachlinger discussing the legal rights for LGBT families and couples. John, let's pick up on what are the options for parents who are not legal parents in the same-sex relationship.
Well, if unfortunately the parties didn't do a second parent adoption, and someone has been acting like a parent for a period of time, they're really left with one option. Fortunately, the New Jersey Supreme Court back in 2000 ruled in a case called VC versus MJB that a non-legal parent can become what's called a psychological parent. And to become a psychological parent, you have to prove four things. You have to prove, one, that the other legal parent basically allowed you to be a parent. They consented to the relationship and they fostered it. Two, that you lived with the child for some period of time. Three, that you performed parent-like activities with the child. You took the child to the doctor, you financially supported the child, so you acted like a parent. And then fourth, you have to prove that there's a psychological bond between you and the parent, that there's a parent-child bond. So if you prove those four things, then the court can create a status for you called psychological parent, and you actually step into the shoes of a legal parent. But very importantly, you're not a legal parent. So if something happens to the legal parent, there's no presumption that you automatically get custody of the children or child or children, and more importantly, that child doesn't have inheritance rights from you. That child isn't going to be able to get Social Security benefits if something happens to you. So there are a lot of downsides, but at least the court can grant joint custody and parenting time rights to a psychological parent.
Is that likely to change at any point so that greater rights are conferred both upon the child and the parent?
Well, I don't know. The issue that we have, it actually goes back to, it's very similar to our grandparent right cases. There's a balancing act between the constitutional rights of parents to be free of the courts telling them how to raise their kids and who kids should have access to. This is exactly why grandparents don't have rights to visitation except in circumstances where they prove that the child would be harmed. But the fact of the matter is, this statute, or I should say this Supreme Court decision, actually hasn't changed in 15 years. It's the same law it has been for 15 years, because it gives the court, I think, a lot of discretion on how to interpret a relationship between a non-legal parent and a child and do what's best for the child. But the problem is that it costs a lot of money to litigate these cases. And a lot of times people don't have the money to litigate it. And I think the law is very confusing if you don't have an attorney, and quite frankly, a lot of the judges don't even know what the law is or how to interpret the law. So not having an attorney can be a very, very dangerous proposition for someone who's really, it's a matter of, do you ever see your kids again or not? Because if you're not a psychological parent, guess what? Legal parent doesn't have to allow you to ever see your children again, and they can keep you away from their kids.
Well, what also sounds a bit horrid is that how do you prove that you're a psychological parent? It sounds expensive, but how do you prove it?
Well, you're right, it is horrid, but it's very, very difficult. Sometimes the facts are very, very just lend themselves to anyone looking at it and saying, there's no way this person's not a psychological parent. But the problem it becomes, in fact, I'm doing several of these cases right now, the problem becomes, what do you do with like a 1.5-year-old child who, may see you as mom or dad, but is that enough? Is that enough to say there's a parent-child bond? How long did you have to live with the child? One of the 4 factors is how long have you lived with the child? Is it sufficient you live with them for a month, or do you have to live with them for a couple of years? So the fact of the matter is, we don't know all the time what's going to sort of move a judge to believing that there should be a psychological parent status, because they're always troubled by interfering with a parent. Because we don't want, the Supreme Court made it very clear that you can't be a nanny or someone who's paid and become a psychological parent. But even then, how do we stop step-parents from becoming psychological parents and basically divorcing on their spouse, who is the other legal parent, and getting some kind of rights that really tear a child between multiple people? It's very hard, and I gotta tell you, the family judges, I certainly would never want to be one. Family judges are really, really struggling with this on a daily basis.
Are psychologists employed to help the process at all?
Yes.
And do they help the process?
Well, they certainly help empty bank accounts, but psychologists, there are a lot of really good psychologists that do this a lot. And in my opinion, you don't always have to have a psychologist to deal with psychological parent cases or custody cases, for that matter. Not everything requires a psychologist. Some things are common sense. Some things are logical. Some things we don't need a psychologist to come in and tell us what is pretty evident to everyone in the room. Same thing goes with establishing a parent-child bond. How do you do it? Very different things. In some of my cases, I present tons of videos and photographs of a child interacting with someone that could be no one other than a parent. But really, that goes back to the judge. And what does the judge think is appropriate? And what are their, how do they feel about this? And let me tell you, it's different all over the place.
Now, is there a role for mediation in any of this? Because I know the tempers and the emotions are high, and in opposite sex divorces, breakups, custody battles, there is mediation.
Oh, absolutely. Well, a lot of this goes back to who has talked to the legal parent and what have they been told? If they've been told by an attorney or somebody else that the other parent has no rights, they have to prove that they're a psychological parent, and they sort of go in with that mindset, they may not be willing to negotiate anything. They may look at it as, go ahead and prove your case. Because if you prove your case, then I can still say you shouldn't have custody. Because remember, you have to go through 2 steps. You have to prove you're psychological parent, and then you have to prove you should have some custodial rights. There's 2 separate issues here. So mediation, I gotta tell you, in general, mediation is always recommended for everyone who's in a LGBT dispute, no matter what it is, because quite frankly, we don't know what the courts are gonna do because there's so little case law out there. And I know that as much as attorneys and like to create new law, I would certainly not want to be a litigant with my name connected to a case for all time, particularly when we don't know how the court's going to rule. It could be a very bad result for the LGBT community, and that's why a lot of us that do this work a lot try not to get the courts involved and try to resolve things out of court, but as you know, it's not always possible.
Okay, let's talk about something that's a little bit happier. Can same-sex couples adopt? Can individuals adopt?
Absolutely. New Jersey, it's been fine for many years.
And I meant gay individuals.
Yes.
It was a phone between you and me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no issues whatsoever. You can adopt someone. You can adopt a child as a single person in New Jersey. There's absolutely no requirement. You know, and I really think that's the way it should be. There's enough children out there that need homes, good, loving homes, and I'm glad to hear that New Jersey doesn't create any barriers, and that includes same-sex couples.
Are most attorneys versed in these issues that we're now talking about?
Absolutely not. In fact, there's very few that are. This isn't traditional family law like many very good attorneys throughout the state practice. This is a very specific area of law that changes all the time. And when I say all the time, I mean just in the past couple of years, every couple months you'll hear another court somewhere in the country coming down with another case declaring laws to either be constitutional or unconstitutional. The laws keep changing. And as the laws keep changing, if you're not staying up to date, you don't know how to advise your clients as it relates to the government benefits that stem from relationships, whether someone should enter into a relationship, should they terminate the relationship, what are the effects going to be. If you don't really know what you're talking about, you can really create, I mean, forget about malpractice and doing malpractice, you can really injure people's lives if you don't know what you're doing. And that's why I highly recommend that anyone who's looking for an attorney that handles these issues, go to the New Jersey State Bar Association website and look at the LGBT rights section, where you'll find a lot of attorneys that just sort of devote their practice towards the advancement of these issues and keep up to date with all the latest happenings.
Do you know, or would someone looking for an attorney that understands LGBT rights know how up to date they are, how good they are? Or is there any way to know that?
Well, I would ask an attorney if they're not part of the State Bar Association section. I would ask them how often do they go to continuing legal education classes that deal with LGBT issues. There aren't that many every year. In fact, there's only one all-day seminar that's offered every year. Ask them if they go to these. Ask them how many cases they've handled. You know, unfortunately in this economy, a lot of, not just attorneys, business people that have businesses, they try to get customers wherever they come from. Yes. And unfortunately, because of that, people are willing to take anything that walks in the door. And I think that if you practice family law, there's a temptation, well, I can do that, because I do family law. Or estate planning. I do estate planning, I can handle this. But if you really don't know the intricacies of what's going on, you can really damage people's lives. And I can't emphasize enough that people really look at who their attorney is. Don't just listen to, you know, Jane down the street who, you know, got the best divorce settlement in the world, and I'm going to go to that attorney. Look for people who actually know what they're doing, because there are things going on that just don't happen in opposite-sex divorces or marriages or relationships.
And my last question is for the gay individual that is not out. How does being involved in all of these processes impact them? Is this a public record?
Yes, unfortunately, our courts are public. Unless it involves the abuse of a child, or DCPMP proceedings, courtrooms are open to the public. Not only are they open to the public, the pleadings you file are public. Unless you ask the court to seal your case, and courts rarely grant those requests to seal cases because there's an interest, a public interest, in having an open judiciary system. So unfortunately, that's used quite frequently to intimidate people who aren't out. It happens a lot in domestic violence contexts too, where someone who's not out won't come forward because they're afraid of being outed to the community, even if they're subject to abuse. It happens, same thing with custody disputes, divorces. Someone might use that to their advantage in saying, I'll divorce you and I'll make sure everyone knows that you're gay. And so, unfortunately, it's just something that we have to deal with, and hopefully over time, society will get to the point where being gay doesn't matter.
Well, you raised something I want to sneak in. Do domestic violence laws apply to same-sex couples?
Absolutely. It's exactly the same. Laws, unfortunately, like with a lot of things, there's a lot of prejudice out there, particularly in police departments, where, you know, a guy hitting a guy or a girl hitting a girl, some police officers don't see that as domestic violence. They just see that as, you know, two guys are fighting. You know, it's not domestic violence. And training's helping, but there needs to be a lot more training. There's some communities are well ahead of other communities, but unfortunately, until we get everyone sort of to the same place and allow cops to recognize that domestic violence occurs even with same-sex couples, I think we're still going to see disparate impacts, because if a cop doesn't see anything, a lot of times someone won't even think about filing a restraining order.
John, thank you very much for
You're
some
absolutely
very
welcome.
important information. And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Know Your Rights, New Jersey.
Thank you.